This is a drawing that I made last month. It's made as a preparation for a painting that I'm going to make on this canvas. One of the things that's very interesting about a transfer drawing is it removes a certain part of the searching that can take place on a canvas. I find them to be most useful and most interesting when you have a project that effectively you cannot fail on. So if you're making a painting and there are consequences there as a client already, a place that you don't want to find yourself kind of deviating from your kind of step-by-step process is if you have to sort of maybe go back a couple stages to fix a drawing that maybe you should have seen earlier but you didn't. We all know the kind of difficulties that you face when you're painting figurative work. A transfer drawing is there to get your sense of design up to a certain plateau. That's only one thing that a transfer drawing does. In addition, it's very much my feeling that transfer drawings and drawings in general are a way that you kind of internalize knowledge about the visual world. So we glance at a model once and we notice certain things. Maybe she has blonde hair or he has blonde hair. Maybe they have a long nose or a short nose or very big eyes or small eyes. We notice maybe some superficial details about this model. When you spend 10, 12, 14 hours actually drawing out all of these subtle features that a model has in the turning of form across their face, in just the precise shape of their ear, in the relationship, the size of the head to the size of their body, all of these things require deep introspection when you're actually producing a drawing through the observation of them. And in fact, for me, it's mostly those things that I feel show up when I transfer a drawing onto a canvas. Certainly there is a nice sense of proportion that has been arranged. More so, there is the sense that the subject of the drawing has become a part of your knowledge. You have a deeper, closer look at that subject than you would just in passing it over once or twice. I'm going to be putting an imprimatura on this canvas. The word imprimatura is Italian and it means, if you translate it quite directly, just first coat. So we're putting down a kind of a base layer of paint onto this canvas so that we can, in a way, kind of realize the values in two directions. Think about how you would work with like a white chalk drawing, right? You would start to darken the values of the shadows and simultaneously you'd be adding white chalk to areas of light to kind of expand the expression of the value range. Putting an imprimatura on a canvas allows you to do that. One of the things that it removes is that bright white canvas staring back at you, which can, in reality, affect the way that you see the values that you're putting onto the canvas. What might look like a fairly kind of light value on your palette, when you put it onto your canvas, in fact, can seem quite dark. And until you kind of develop and build the entire context, you may find yourself kind of questioning how dark those values are. This is the canvas that I'm going to be working on today. It's an oil prime linen. It was handmade by a guy who has a studio in the Bronx. He makes these very small batches of really, really fine weave linen. He uses lead pigment in his oil grounds. So we have, for archivability purposes, a really wonderful, bright archival surface to work on. A couple of things that you want to consider when you're choosing the color and value of your imprimatura. Start with the materials, right? We want pigments that are fast drying. Generally speaking, we would prefer transparent pigments. Even though today I'm actually going to do a little bit of a different take on that. I'm going to be using some flake white in my imprimatura, which strictly speaking is not something you necessarily want to do, as white paints tend to take a little bit longer to dry than, say, some earth pigments like raw umbers and so on. I'm going to take my initiative as an artist and choose to actually take an imprimatura that fits more my aesthetic purposes than it does those archival purposes. Side note to that, it's really important to remember that rules about archivability are there to give you a good suggestion. In a perfect world, we would all have what George O'Hanlon from Natural Pigments calls the best painting practices. That being said, if the best painting practices do not suit your sort of aesthetic purposes, I think for me at least, I will prioritize my aesthetic purposes up to a certain point. I'm not going to paint on cardboard or something that might deteriorate very quickly. But say the choice of pigments in a first layer of a painting, I might give myself the benefit of the doubt in terms of creating a surface that I'm really excited about instead of one that is perfectly archival. Some of the tools that I'm going to need to put on this Imprimatura I have here on the easel. I brought with me the two paint tubes containing the color that I'm going to use. I have one that is a Van Dyke Brown made by Williamsburg Oil Paints, and then also a Flake White. I'm going to be tinting the Van Dyke Brown up to a pretty high key color value, and then applying that in a thin wash over the canvas. In addition to kind of mix up that tint, I've got my palette knife here. I can't tell you what the brand is, I don't remember, but the shape of it is really particular in the sense that I like a good maybe 3-inch kind of teardrop shape. I find it quite versatile and quite flexible. I don't always put an Imprimatura on with a brush. I thought though that in this instance it'd be interesting to do so, just so you can see the paint going across the surface, how much of it I'm actually putting on, and if need be, how much I need to kind of take off with a paper towel afterwards. I have a bit of linseed oil mixed with spike lavender oil that I'm using as a kind of medium to thin out the paint. A lot of people, when they do this, they'll use turpentine or some distilled kind of mineral spirits. Because I work in a studio that doesn't have a ton of ventilation, I try to keep kind of caustic chemicals down to an absolute minimum. And spike lavender oil, of course, though it can be an irritant, is not actually caustic in that way that turpentine or mineral spirits would be. Right, so I'm going to be blocking in today. I've already made some pre-mixtures on my palette and set that all out, so I'm kind of ready to roll. I did want to discuss maybe some of the brushes that I'm going to use while I'm blocking in, and maybe also some of the thoughts that I have about like what I'm going to be doing during that sort of stage of the painting. You can see here that I've got a series of kind of color values mixed out. These are what I would call kind of like generic flesh tones. They're not meant to be reflecting necessarily a pixel to pixel accuracy in terms of like what a skin tone looks like. But certainly they're sort of fairly warm, analogous colors that if you kind of built them together into a gradation would look quite natural with each other. The reason that I mention analogous in that is particular because if we have like too much kind of temperature or color diversity between like kind of blue and orange, in these pre-mixtures, we're going to have a difficulty getting them to sit comfortably next to each other. In the early stages of a painting, I actually try to focus a lot more on value and a lot more on surface than I actually do on color. That comes more in the kind of final painting or whatever kind of glazes and scumbles that I'm sort of adding more at the end of the painting. The brushes that I'm going to use today to kind of block in have some characteristics that are quite uniform in the sense that I like a very soft synthetic bristle. Hog bristle brushes, sometimes I find the tensile strength is a little bit too heavy and it can actually kind of scrape some of the paint off the surface while you're trying to apply it. I find that I'm able to kind of scrub and wash around the lower layers of the painting really well with these very soft bristle brushes, and I have a couple of shapes that I will normally employ in this moment. I do like to have a very fine pointed round, a couple of them at least to kind of start out, and those are actually for the kind of linear work that I'm going to be doing. When I'm laying in values, more often than not, I'm going to be using a filbert shaped brush. Now, not all filberts are kind of created equal in the sense that like different brands will have different shapes and different kind of numbers for their various sizes. I always try to kind of keep in mind that when I'm painting, I try to use the size of the brush for the size of the subject that I'm painting. So if I'm blocking in the light shape of the neck versus blocking in the shadow shape of the nostril, I'm probably going to be using maybe a slightly different size brush for each of those. That gets more and more kind of refined as the painting goes on and you're actually looking to kind of subtly turn forms and things. It becomes really, really useful to have the right size brush. At this stage where all the problems are going to be so big, you know, a larger kind of filbert can kind of uniformly do most of what you want to do. Until I get to areas like the hair or say the coat where in fact like using a really kind of small brush like the one I would use for the cheekbone or something would actually maybe look a little bit fussy, I think. So I'll probably switch to a larger filbert shaped brush at that time. I don't intend to do a whole lot with the background right now. In fact, like one of the concepts that I want to have in this painting that I want to work with is I'd actually really like the background to be all done in one pass to whatever extent I actually do something to it. I cultivated this kind of texture in the imprimatura. It's actually something that I'd like to kind of hold on to for the most part. There are going to be instances in which I'll probably paint around the edges of the figure, but the plan is to maintain a lot of that kind of vibrance and action from the shapes and kind of brush strokes in the background. A few words on the palette that I'm choosing for this painting. Really, it's quite a limited palette, right? And this is something that I've certainly gotten used to over the years at the Academy. It is highly recommended for kind of beginning students, right? Where you're working on paint handling skills, you're working on value, you're working on rendering. At that point in your educational career, it's pretty advisable to kind of simplify a little bit in terms of the color diversity that your palette is capable of. Once you get used to the idea that a palette really is kind of an artistic choice, I think you can find the merits in a very limited palette. In the sense that if I was an outdoors impressionist painter who loved the paintings of Monet, a limited palette perhaps is not the best way to kind of attain that sensation. If you're a studio painter and you love the paintings of Rembrandt and Ribera, a limited palette is going to have more than enough chromatic range to get you to where those artists were taking their work. A couple thoughts on this project from a procedural perspective, right? At this stage of the painting, I'm just trying to establish some of the basic things that I would normally try to do in a drawing, actually, right? So I'll probably start out by beginning to kind of fill in some of the shadow shapes. So some of the darker areas that I built out in my drawing, I'm going to take my shadow mixture and start thinly painting those in. There is a temptation probably at this moment of the painting for beginning painters to hear the words thinly painted and consider that that means actually adding a lot of medium to the paint or a lot of linseed oil. This is not going to be the case. Actually, in the lower layers of the painting, I try to keep things rather lean, which is to say that I don't add a lot of oil to them. I add a little bit, of course, to help me kind of push around the paint on the surface, but for the most part, I try to keep it just as much as possible, just the actual paint mixtures that I've made. Sometimes you'll find that some of your pigments have made a mixture a little bit more viscous or a little bit, what you would say, it's like shorter, in that case, yeah, you want to extend it a little bit with linseed oil, but I would always be aware of kind of adding too much of that. One of the things that happens when you add too much medium at an early stage is you tend to get really kind of sharp edges, and the paint being that much more slippery, it's actually very difficult to control. So maybe try to kind of hold back a little bit on adding medium at these early stages. It's not to say that it's never a thing that you want to do, but it's a thing that probably is impractical just from the standpoint of wanting to have a little bit more kind of control over your oil paint at this phase. There's a necessary change that needs to happen, I think, in the project when you go from a transfer drawing into an oil painting. Part of the risk is to consider that your painting is simply going to be a painting of your drawing. The choices that you made there are simply going to be transformed into paint, and that it will be, in a way, kind of a faithful rendering of what that pencil drawing was. For me, and I think probably for a lot of people, I would encourage you to make that not exactly the case, which is to say that a lot of the shapes that I evolved and discovered throughout, say, the side plane of the head, the hair and so on, were shapes that are in a way married to that drawing. And I'm not going to carry them forward in any precise way in my oil painting. What I'm going to do is allow the medium of paint and the process that I'm creating here to rediscover those shapes, different shapes in fact. And so when you see this kind of moving and evolving, you're definitely going to see the echo or the spirit of those shapes that I designed. But in no way am I going to be maybe tied to exactly the configuration that I made in a pencil drawing. Part of the reason is because you want to keep a project fresh, you want to keep it exciting, and I think that a journey of discovery for me is more exciting than, strictly speaking, kind of rendering out something that already exists. But in addition, you want to keep the paint looking lively, you want to keep the paint looking fresh. There's a great quote by De Laszlo, who was John Singer Sargent's teacher, that I'm going to paraphrase here. But he said that it's not difficult to have freshness in a painting that is made in one pass, but in a painting where there are several passes, 10 passes, 15 passes, to keep freshness in a painting like that is incredibly challenging and incredibly difficult. And so one of the things that I want to do, kind of working on this painting as I'm going to in a series of stages, is to leave myself the opportunity to create that freshness. So I wanted to build up the light and the shadow and the form before I actually added in the shapes that kind of definitively lock those areas into place. And that's very much going to be the case here. As you watch me kind of paint the hair, I'm going to be really looking at the overall sense of form of the head rather than maybe getting specifically into individual kind of strands of hair. In this way, I'm hopefully going to sort of flip the process a little bit on its head in terms of how we normally think about creating a rendering of something. We would think that outlining all of the hair and then kind of coloring it in, maybe that's the instinctive idea of how you would go about sort of creating an image of something. In this case, I'm going to try and reserve those brush strokes that are going to kind of define the kind of movement of the hair till just a little bit later in the process. It's really important to remember this moment that we're trying to make a limited expression of the final painting, which is to say that while I do want to cultivate a kind of a softness in the halftones, the blending that I'm doing is probably more related to not wanting to leave behind a particularly harsh edge, rather than actually considering that right now the modulations and the modeling that I'm making are going to be anything that is necessarily a full realization of the final painting. Patience and attention to procedure, like at this stage, is actually really important. You might find also that I'm going to start kind of placing some of the impastos that I plan to make an expression of later. That's mostly so that I get a good kind of underlayer with a bit of body to it, so that as I begin to kind of paint on top of that, I'm able to kind of bring that impasto also into being kind of a part of the overall kind of form that I'm painting. I find that, at least for me, my process, impastos work the kind of best in layers. And so I tend not to kind of leave them for maybe the last thing that I put on. Otherwise, I feel like they don't necessarily kind of integrate into the paint film or into the form that I'm painting. A lot of the block-in is, I think, coming along pretty well. You can see that I'm working in a kind of muted value range. And I'm also, like I said before, I'm not really letting too many edges kind of stop the value as it kind of flows in between these different planes and different sections. What I'm developing here is kind of a basis or a foundation. On top of that, I'm going to make the kind of final painting. The coloring right now is relatively, you would say, kind of dead in the sense that there's not a profound amount of kind of color variation in between like maybe warm and cool temperatures. You can see though that I've started to express some of the warmer temperatures, and that is contrasting with some of these more kind of neutral colors in a way familiar to how kind of classic skin tones are going to work. None of this yet is really painted too opaquely. There are a couple of areas of kind of highlight where I've pushed a little bit more paint onto the surface, gotten up to maybe a little bit of an impasto. But otherwise, the rest is really quite see-through. This is entirely on purpose in the sense that I want the kind of final painting to take place more or less in one layer. Perhaps after that I'll do some glazes and scumbles to kind of touch things up. But overall, I would like this to be a sufficient basis so that in the next painting, the next session that I make on this, I'm able to actually mostly wrap up the head. In that way, I'll be retaining some of the kind of freshness of approach that I think you get when, you know, the entire surface from side to side is kind of painted in one moment. There are some things like maybe subtle sort of lights passing over the eyelid that I'm going to take some extra time to kind of dive into, which I don't perceive that I'll really be able to do maybe in the next session. But I'm going to try my best to get them all sort of laid out as they're supposed to be. I'm going to continue kind of working around some of the halftone shapes and halftone values that are adding a little bit of structure to some of these areas like the chin and the nose. But more so I'm going to be trying to make sure that I don't kind of interrupt the kind of flow of light throughout the painting. By that I mean, if you think back to the drawing that I made for this, right? And eventually how I punctuated these kind of forms with these very definitive shadow edges. This is important in the kind of closing moments that we really tie in that idea of kind of light and shadow. For this painting at the moment though, I would like very much to have a kind of unbroken flow of light throughout all of the areas of the face that are really being kind of touched by that light. Even some things like the shadow in the ear, I'm choosing, at least right now, to completely forego in the hopes that I can get the kind of underlying planes and values to be arranged in such a way that they're kind of a ghost or an echo of what they're going to be eventually. You can see on the palette right now a little bit the way that I'm using these pre-mixtures. Some of them, like the shadow value, I'm taking directly from the palette and applying that straight away to the areas of the face that are in shadow. Many of the other passages though, anything kind of contained within the light shape, more often than not I find that I'm mixing in between them in order to kind of make a kind of sub-mixture that then I apply to the painting. This will become more and more the way that I use this as time goes on. When you see in the final painting, primarily I'll be mixing between these flesh tones to kind of get to a place where I have a really good accurate color value to apply. And that's the way I want you to think about them. There's two kinds of kind of palette concepts that we can work with. One is an open palette and the other is a closed palette. For instance, an open palette, right, is going to be that you just work from your pure pigments and you basically kind of brush mix for each application. This is good and interesting, but you can see that there's probably a little bit of a sacrifice of control over exactly the value that you're mixing. And then a closed palette would be that you're taking these pre-mixtures and all of them go directly from the palette onto the painting. This of course is a kind of combination in between those two where I do have pre-mixtures. Some of them make their way from the palette directly to the painting without an admixture or an adjustment. But more often than not, like I said, I'm kind of actually mixing back and forth in between them. With the exception of the shadow I tend to kind of hold back on any sort of addition or mixing in with other pigments. I might warm it up with a bit of vermilion or a bit of my yellow brown, but more often than not, it's going to make its way straight onto the canvas. The reason being echoes outward from that idea that shadow is atmosphere and light is form. I want to keep my shadows both very even and very flat. And then I want to use the kind of technique that I apply with to give them a little bit of a sense of kind of variety inside. I often say that there's kind of like a mixture in between like painting something even and then like painting something like the side of a barn or a wall where there's just no variation. Looking at this, you'd say that the value overall is mostly very unified, but also there's enough breadth or texture kind of coming through that we're not convinced that it's maybe totally flat. I think moving forward, what I'm kind of aiming at right now is to kind of get the overall kind of silhouette of her coat kind of completed. I actually want to leave a lot of the background kind of flowing through the hair. In fact, I'm even considering maybe like actually taking away some of the paint that I added to sections like this, just so I can allow the highlight to kind of effectively set itself off from the dark of the hair. Simply while being the value of the background. Then I think I'll probably disperse a little bit the sense of like light and shadow within the design of the coat, just so I know when I'm sort of painting on this tomorrow where my kind of darkest darks are going to be and how I'm going to let some of the warmth in the light areas kind of come through behind the cooler temperatures that I paint on top of it. In addition to that, like looking at the head, I think that there are probably some form issues that I might want to render out a little bit in the nose. And also maybe to look at some of the more specific aspects to the ear. Beyond that, I'm going to try and keep it open and try and leave myself the space to realize these areas like the hair, like the neck, like the painting of the eye socket. Tomorrow when I actually use kind of full opaque paint and kind of dive in to kind of making this into an oil painting. Some things have kind of become apparent and they're interesting to talk about. Some things we really have to kind of just wait until the next stage. But I did want to point out maybe a couple tools that I've started to use that I haven't talked about yet. In particular these two. So you have this one, which is effectively a barbecue skewer, is what we would call it here in the States. It's really just a thin piece of wood with a sort of sharpened end at one side. I used to actually sharpen the back end of my paintbrushes to kind of effect a similar kind of tool. But this I just use in like kind of block-in stages. If say that I want to move one of these lines back or forth a little bit or add a little bit more kind of subtlety to the gesture of one of the contours, I'll use one of these skewers to kind of effect that change. And you have another one that is really a highly specialized brush. And in fact, I even found these really quite hard to find in this particular make and model. It's a brush made by Royal and Langnickel. It's in their Zen series. And I think it's marketed as a watercolor brush, but it's kind of a pointy-ended filbert, really quite long bristles. And I kind of use it as maybe a kind of, in the way that I use a blending stump maybe when I'm drawing. Like if I have some edges or brush strokes that I'm not so fond of, these bristles on this brush, which have a very kind of low tensile strength, right? Like they're really, really bendy. They don't disrupt the surface too much. So they allow me to kind of push the paint around a little bit just to kind of take the edges off of it without actually like removing paint or totally disturbing the shape of the brush stroke that was on the canvas. So I find those two like really useful in a block-in stage. This one for students, I know that if and when I recommend it, like it can become a tool that does as much harm as it does good. It's not something that I would recommend to use actually for blending unless your colors and values were really attuned. You might see later that if I'm kind of working in some of these areas, I might actually kind of take this and soften a bit of an edge with it. Bear in mind that the important thing to have in place before you do that is a really good value gradation that leads actually towards the shadow. So if I have really light values like this and really dark values like this, I won't actually blend in between them with this just in order to make that kind of softness or turning of form. For that, I would more rely on having good kind of a good set of kind of values that lead up to that shadow edge. One of the things that I constantly think about is to exercise a kind of restraint. It would be very easy to get kind of carried away and start to kind of work on some of the value transitions or subtly turning forms, or even more so, wanting to kind of etch out some of the shapes like the mouth or the shadow shapes around the eye socket or the design of the lower half of the ear. All of these aspects I've been consciously kind of holding myself back from, especially as it pertains to like, you know, some of these shapes running along the hairline where it meets the actual form of the face. And you can see here on my iPad, you know, there's plenty of kind of darker accent in there that I could kind of pull out to help kind of define that. But I want to hold off, I want to wait, because I want to do that also in the kind of final layer, because I feel like those things are kind of best left on top of the painting.